Major Viktor Sokolov was a man of the map, the stopwatch, and the socialist doctrine of overwhelming mass. In July 1972, he was a senior military advisor for the Soviet GRU, stationed in the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. His mission was as clear as the blue waters of the Arabian Sea: to oversee the final decisive blow against the British-backed Sultanate of Oman. Sokolov believed in the irresistible tide. He believed that a revolution, if armed with enough AK-47s and fueled by the dialectical inevitability of history, could not be stopped by a fading colonial power. "The British are a ghost of the 19th century," Sokolov wrote in a classified dispatch to Moscow. "They are trying to hold the Dhofar province with a handful of officers and a scattering of local irregulars. Our proxies, the Aloo, have the numbers. They have the training. They have the ideological fire. We have prepared an assault force of 250 elite guerrillas, the best the PFLOAG has to offer. They will strike the coastal town of Mirbat, seize the fort, and signal the end of British influence in the Middle East. I have calculated the resistance. The town is defended by a small detachment of the Special Air Service, 9 men. The mathematics of the assault are 25 to 1. By my estimation, the engagement will be over in 15 minutes. Mirbat will fall before the sun is fully above the horizon." Sokolov sat in a concealed observation post on the jagged slopes of the Jebel, looking down at the small, white-walled town of Mirbat. To his eyes, the town looked like a tomb waiting to be sealed. He saw the BATT house, the British Army Training Team headquarters, where the 9 SAS men were stationed. It was a simple stone building, vulnerable and isolated. "I looked at the British through my binoculars," Sokolov recalled years later in his memoirs. "They didn't look like an elite unit. They didn't have the parade ground polish of our Spetsnaz. They wore mismatched tropical kit, sarongs and sandals.
They spent their days treating the local villagers for eye infections and repairing water pumps. I told the Aloo commanders that these were not warriors, they were social workers in uniform. I told them that the thinking soldier was a British myth designed to cover up their lack of manpower. I was wrong. I was about to witness the moment where the mathematics of mass collided with the geometry of the standard, and I was about to see my calculations incinerated in the heat of a desert morning." To understand Sokolov's mistake, you have to understand the strategic landscape of Oman in 1972. The Dhofar rebellion was a secret war. The British government, wary of public opinion after the Suez Crisis, refused to admit that its special forces were engaged in active combat. The SAS were officially there as advisors. They were the hearts and minds element of a counterinsurgency campaign that was designed to be invisible. The American doctrine at the time, as seen in Vietnam, was about the body count, Sokolov noted. Our doctrine was about the massed breakthrough. But the SAS had a third way. They called it the long game. They didn't want to kill the population. They wanted to own the environment. But on the morning of July 19, 1972, the environment was about to become a furnace, and the long game was about to be compressed into a 300-meter killing zone. The Aloo assault force was a sophisticated machine. These were not random tribesmen. They were disciplined fighters trained in the Soviet schools of urban and mountain warfare. They were armed with SKS carbines, Kalashnikovs, and heavy 81mm mortars. They moved through the pre-dawn mist of the Kharif, the monsoon season, with a silence that even Sokolov admired. "We had the weather," Sokolov said. "The mist was so thick you couldn't see 20 meters in front of you. It neutralized the British advantage in air support.
Their Strike Master jets were grounded at Salalah.
The 9 men in Mirbat were truly alone. I checked my watch. 5 o'clock. The Adoo began their final approach. They were 200 meters from the perimeter wire. I remember thinking that I was watching the last 10 minutes of the British Empire. What Sokolov didn't know, what his GRU training hadn't prepared him for, was the nature of the Brecon filter. He didn't understand that the 9 men in the bat house had been through a selection process that was designed to find the 1% of the 1% who could function when the map was gone and the numbers were impossible. The SAS detachment at Mirbat was led by Captain Mike Keeley, a 23-year-old officer who embodied the thinking soldier. He didn't have a battalion. He had a sergeant, a few corporals, and a handful of troopers. Among them was a giant of a man named Talaiasi Labalaba, a Fijian who had survived the most brutal training the British military had to offer. The British system doesn't build teams first. It builds individuals, Sokolov observed, and then it trusts those individuals to improvise a team out of thin air. In the Soviet army, if the commander dies, the unit stops. In the SAS, if the commander dies, the corporal becomes the commander. If the corporal dies, the trooper becomes the commander. The standard is carried by every man. It is a biological redundancy that we simply didn't account for. At 5:15, the first shots rang out. An Adoo scout was spotted by a local Omani sentry at the fort, a secondary stone structure 300 meters from the bat house. The sentry fired a single shot, and the desert silence was instantly replaced by the roar of 250 weapons firing at once. Sokolov watched the initial surge. It was perfect. The Adoo hit the fort with a wave of fire. The Omani defenders, mostly older men and local militia, were overwhelmed in seconds. The Adoo were over the wire. They were in the town. They were shouting Allah Akbar and firing into the windows of the bat house. I looked for the white flag. I looked for the panic. Instead, I saw a single man run out of the bat house toward an old, rusted piece of equipment sitting in a sandpit. The equipment was an Oerlikon 25-pounder field gun, a relic from the Second World War. It was designed to be operated by a crew of 6 men. It was heavy, slow, and required complex manual calculations to fire. I saw the Fijian Labalaba reach the gun, Sokolov recalled. He was under a hail of bullets. He was alone. He was doing the work of 6 men. He was loading the shell, adjusting the sights, and firing at point-blank range into the advancing Adoo. It was a madness. A field gun is not a sniper rifle, but in the hands of that man it became a surgical instrument. Each 25-pound shell was landing in the middle of our assault groups, turning the mass into a mess of fire and bone. Sokolov felt the first flicker of doubt. The mathematics were still 25-1, but the geometry of the gun was starting to rewrite the equation. The 15-minute victory was disappearing in the smoke of the 25-pounder. I turned to the Adoo commander and told him to suppress the gun, Sokolov said. I told him it was only 1 man, but the 1 man was refusing to die, and in the bat house, the other 8 were starting to wake up. The thinking soldier was about to show me the price of my arrogance. The Battle of Mirbat had begun, and Major Viktor Sokolov was about to realize that he wasn't watching a massacre. He was watching a transformation. The 9 men from Hereford were about to become the ghosts of the desert. The Kharif mist in Dhofar is not like a normal fog. It is a wet, suffocating blanket that clings to the skin and turns the desert floor into a slippery sludge. Major Viktor Sokolov, watching from his perch on the ridge, could barely see the white walls of Mirbat through the grey haze, but he could hear the sound of the world ending.
In Soviet doctrine, we are taught to listen for the pulse of the battle, Sokolov noted.
A battle has a rhythm. Usually, it is the rhythm of the stronger force crushing the weaker. But the rhythm coming from the Mirbat perimeter was wrong. The Adoo were firing thousands of rounds, a chaotic, overwhelming roar of Kalashnikovs and RPD machine guns. But the response from the British was slow, methodical. It was the sound of a bolt-action rifle being cycled and a single 25-pounder gun being fired with the regularity of a clock. It was the sound of men who were not in a hurry to die. The center of this rhythmic defiance was a sandbagged pit 300 meters from the Bat House. Inside that pit sat the Ehrlichen 25-pounder, a piece of artillery that was an anachronism even in 1972. It was a massive, cumbersome beast of steel that required a 6-man crew to operate efficiently. 1 man to aim, 1 to load, 1 to set the fuses, 1 to clear the breach, and 2 to handle the heavy ammunition crates. Talaiasi Labalaba, a Fijian sergeant in the SAS, was doing it all by himself. "I saw Labalaba through the gaps in the mist," Sokolov recalled. "It was a spectacle of biological impossibility. He was a mountain of a man, stripped to the waist, his skin glistening with sweat and rain. He was sprinting between the breach and the ammunition piles, hauling 25-pound shells that should have required 2 men to lift at that speed. He would load, slam the breach, leap to the sights, and fire at point-blank range. The recoil of the gun was so violent it was jumping out of the sand. But Labalaba was wrestling it back into position like a man fighting a wild animal. The shells were not being fired over the horizon. Labalaba had lowered the barrel until it was horizontal. He was using a field gun as a sniper rifle against a mass of 250 men. The effect was devastating, Sokolov said.
The Adoo were used to the fear of the big gun, the psychological impact of artillery falling from the sky. But they were not prepared for the direct fire of a 25-pounder. Every shell that Labalaba fired didn't just explode, it deleted a 10-meter corridor of the assault. I saw a group of 15 Adoo trying to breach the inner wire. Labalaba fired, and when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but a blackened crater and the smell of ozone. He was holding the entire southern flank of the town with a single piece of iron. Sokolov turned to his radio, his voice rising in frustration. I told the Adoo commanders on the ground to focus everything on the gun pit. I told them, if that gun stays active, you will never reach the Bat House. But the Adoo were beginning to experience the SAS paralysis. It's what happens when you realize that the person you are fighting isn't following the rules of fear. To understand Labalaba's endurance, you have to understand the Fijian pipeline of the regiment. The SAS has always recruited heavily from the Fiji Islands, seeking men who possess a specific combination of immense physical strength and a stoic, unflinching psychological makeup. Labalaba had passed selection in the late 1960s, a time when the hills phase in Wales was even more brutal than it is today. The SAS selection doesn't just filter for fitness, Sokolov observed. It filters for the autonomous engine. They look for the man who can provide his own motivation when there are no officers to lead him and no hope to sustain him. Labalaba was the engine. He didn't need a crew. He had the standard of Hereford, and that was enough to keep the 25-pounder firing. But the mathematics of the 25-to-1 ratio were starting to take their toll. The Adoo were getting closer. They had realized that Labalaba couldn't fire and defend the pit at the same time. Small groups of guerrillas were crawling through the elephant grass, getting within grenade range.
At 6 o'clock, the mist lifted for a few seconds, Sokolov said. I saw a flash of light near the gun pit. An Adoo sniper had finally found a mark. Labalaba was hit. A 7.62mm round shattered his jaw. I watched him fall, and I told the Adoo, "Now! The gun is dead! Move, now!" In the Soviet manual, a jaw-shattering wound is a
mission-ending event. The pain alone is enough to induce shock, but Sokolov watched in horror as the giant Fijian didn't stay down. "He didn't just get up," Sokolov whispered. "He pushed himself up with one hand, holding his jaw together with the other, and then he reached for the next shell. He was bleeding so heavily his chest was red, but he was still loading. He was still firing. He was a different species. He had decided that his jaw didn't matter as much as the geometry of the gun's arc." And then, a second shadow appeared in the pit. It was Sergeant Talaiasi, another Fijian trooper who had run 300 meters from the bathhouse under a hail of fire to reach his brother. Now there were two, Sokolov noted. 2 men in a hole against 200. It was a scene from the Middle Ages. They were back to back. Talaiasi was firing his SLR rifle at the Adoo, who were trying to crawl over the lip of the pit, while Labalaba, his jaw literally hanging off, was still manning the big gun. They were laughing. I could hear it over the roar of the mortars. They were actually laughing. Sokolov realized then that the Adoo were losing the psychological war. They had the numbers, but they were attacking a wall of the spirit. Every time the 25-pounder fired, it wasn't just killing fighters. It was killing the Adoo's belief in victory. "The Adoo commander came to me," Sokolov recalled. He was shaking. He said, "Comrade Sokolov, these are not men. They are Ifrit, demons. We shoot them and they don't stop. We bomb them and they just fire faster." I realized that my calculations of mass were useless.
You cannot calculate the effect of a man who has been flattened by the beacons and rebuilt with the standard of Hereford. One SAS trooper in a gun pit was worth a company of my best-trained guerrillas. Inside the bat house, the other 7 men were not sitting idle. Captain Mike Keeley was orchestrating a moving defense. He had positioned a Vickers machine gun on the roof, another relic of the past that the British refused to retire because of its absolute reliability. "The Vickers is a water-cooled machine gun," Sokolov explained. "It can fire for hours without stopping, as long as you keep the water jacket filled." It was the perfect metaphor for the British. It was old, it was heavy, and it was lethal. Keeley was using the Vickers to bracket the gun pit, creating a curtain of lead that prevented the Adoo from overwhelming Labalaba and Talaiasi. He was playing a game of tactical chess while we were playing a game of checkers. But at 7:15, the situation reached its final, desperate climax. The Adoo had brought up an 81mm mortar and had finally zeroed in on the gun pit. "I saw the impact," Sokolov said. "A direct hit on the ammunition pile. The gun pit was engulfed in a massive fireball. The 25-pounder was knocked off its carriage. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound I've ever heard. I looked at my watch. It had been 2 hours. The 15-minute victory was long gone, but the gun was finally silent. Sokolov believed the battle was over. The engine was destroyed. But as the smoke cleared, he saw the final defining act of the SAS thinking soldier. Labalaba was dead, Sokolov whispered. The blast had finally taken him. But Talaiasi was still there. He was wounded, his body riddled with shrapnel, but he had dragged himself to the lip of the pit with his rifle, and in the distance, I heard a new sound. A sound that shouldn't have been there. The sound of jet engines. The mist had broken. The strike masters were coming. And Major Viktor Sokolov was about to see the mathematics of mass undergo its final, brutal subtraction. Major Viktor Sokolov had spent his career believing that the environment was a variable to be mastered by the commander. In the Soviet military academies, they taught that weather was a neutral factor, something to be accounted for in the logistical chain. But as the Kharif mist suddenly peeled away from the coastline of Mirbat at 7:15, Sokolov realized that for the SAS, the environment was not a variable. It was a co-conspirator. The mist didn't just fade.
Sokolov recalled in his report to the GRU. It retracted like a stage curtain being pulled back by an invisible hand. One moment, the BATT house was a ghostly shape in a sea of grey. The next, the Arabian sun was hitting the white stone with the force of a physical blow. And in that clarity, I realized that the British weren't just waiting for the mist to clear. They were waiting for the sky to become a weapon. I heard the sound of the Strike Master jets long before I saw them. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very rocks I was sitting on. I looked towards Salalah, and I saw them. Two small silver needles cutting through the morning light, flying so low they were kicking up spray from the waves of the Arabian Sea. The BAC Strike Master was, by all Soviet technical standards, a joke. It was a converted training jet, a light attack aircraft that lacked the Mach 2 speed of a MiG or the heavy payload of a Sukhoi. To Sokolov, it was another British anachronism, a budget warplane for a dying empire. I told the Aloo commander to use the heavy ZPU machine guns, Sokolov said. I told him, "It is only a trainer. Lead the nose and you will swat it out of the sky." But I had forgotten the thinking soldier philosophy. The pilots of those jets weren't just aviators. They were extensions of the men on the ground. They were flying on the deck, navigating by the visual cues given to them by Captain Keeley over the radio. They didn't need a radar. They had the standard of the regiment, and they were about to perform a surgical removal of our assault force from the air. The Strike Masters didn't drop their bombs from high altitude. They came in at eye level with the ridge where Sokolov stood. The roar was so intense it shattered the glass in Sokolov's binoculars. The first pass was a demonstration of biological precision, Sokolov noted. The pilot, a man named Flight Lieutenant Ian Ashbrook, dropped a 500-pound bomb so close to the perimeter wire that the shockwave blew the hats off the SAS troopers in the BATT house. It landed directly in the center of the Aloo mortar section. In 4 seconds, the primary threat to the gun pit was vaporized. But the Aloo were not finished. They were 250 men, and they had seen the 25-pounder go silent. They knew that if they could seize the pit, they could use the British gun against the British house. Inside the Bat House, Captain Mike Keeley made a decision that violated every rule of command and control in the Soviet manual. He didn't stay in the safety of the stone walls to coordinate the air support. He realized that the gun pit was the soul of the defense, and that Sergeant Talaiasi was alone there, wounded and surrounded by the bodies of the fallen. I watched through my backup optics, Sokolov whispered. I saw 2 men emerge from the Bat House. They didn't move in a tactical crawl. They sprinted. They had to cover 300 meters of open, flat ground, a killing corridor that was being swept by hundreds of Aloo rifles. It was Captain Keeley and a medic, a man named Tommy Tobin. They were running into a wall of lead. I watched the dust kicking up around their feet. I saw Keeley's smock being shredded by near misses. In our army, an officer does not run into a machine gun nest to save a single sergeant. It is not an efficient use of an asset. But in the SAS, the asset is the brotherhood. The standard dictated that Talaiasi could not be left alone. Keeley and Tobin reached the gun pit at 7:20. What they found there was a scene of industrial-scale slaughter. The ammunition explosion had turned the pit into a charred bowl of black sand and twisted metal. Talaiasi Labalaba lay dead over the breech of the 25-pounder, his hands still gripping the loading tray. Talaiasi was slumped against the sandbags, his rifle empty, his body a map of shrapnel wounds. The medic Tobin didn't look for cover, Sokolov recalled. He immediately began to work on Talaiasi. He was performing surgery in the dirt under a hail of fire, while Keeley took up a position on the lip of the pit with his SLR. I saw the Aloo surging forward. They were 50 meters away. They were shouting. They knew they had the captain. They knew they had the prize. Sokolov watched the
Geometry of the final stand. Keeley was firing his SLR with a rhythmic, terrifying calmness. He wasn't spraying the crowd. He was picking the momentum leaders, the men who were waving their arms, the ones who were screaming the loudest, the ones who were driving the mass forward. In the Soviet school, we teach suppression through volume, Sokolov explained. You fire until the enemy stops moving. Keeley was practicing suppression through psychology. By killing the leaders of the charge, he was turning the mass into a disorganized mob. Every time an Adu fighter tried to climb into the pit, Keeley put a bullet through his chest. It was 19th century marksmanship applied to a 20th century massacre. But the numbers were still against them. Tobin was hit. The medic, the man who was there to save lives, was shot in the face while treating Talaiasi. He didn't die instantly. He kept trying to reach his medical kit. It was the most harrowing thing I have ever seen. The loss of Tobin was the crisis point of the battle.
Keeley was now defending 2 wounded men and a corpse. His ammunition was down to his last 3 magazines, and the strike masters were forced to return to Salalah to refuel and rearm. The 15-minute victory had become a 3-hour agony. I turned to the Adu commander, Sokolov said. I told him, "This is the moment. They have no air. They have no medic. Their captain is pinned in a hole. Charge now, and the town is yours." The Adu commander looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen in a guerrilla fighter before. I saw existential dread. He said to me, "Comrade Sokolov, we have killed them 3 times already. Why are they still firing? If we go into that pit, the earth will swallow us. Those men are not made of flesh." This was the institutional power of the regiment. The standard of Hereford had created a psychological reality that was more powerful than the physical reality of the 25-to-1 ratio. The Adu weren't fighting 9 men. They were fighting a myth that had been forged in the Malayan jungle and the mountains of Wales. They were fighting the ghost of the thinking soldier. At 8:30, the sky roared again, Sokolov noted. The strike masters were back, and this time they weren't alone. I saw a cluster of transport helicopters, Hueys and Bell 205s, approaching from the south. They were carrying the gendarmerie, the Sultan's elite reinforcement unit, but more importantly, they were carrying the end of the Adu's hope. The Adu began to break. It wasn't a tactical withdrawal, it was a dissolution. They began to melt back into the mountains, leaving their dead in the elephant grass. Sokolov stood up from his observation post. He looked down at the gun pit one last time. He saw Captain Mike Keeley standing over the body of Labalaba, his head bowed, his rifle slung. The sun was now high and brutal, reflecting off the white stone of the bat house. The mathematics of the massacre was simple, Sokolov concluded. 250 elite guerrillas had been defeated by 9 men in sandals. We had lost 80 dead and over 100 wounded. The British had lost 2, Labalaba and Tobin. But those 2, they had held the world in their hands for 3 hours. I realized then that the Soviet Union would never win a war against an organization that produced men like that. We could build 1 million tanks, but we could not build a single Talaiasi Labalaba, because you cannot manufacture the standard. You can only discover it in the reign of the beacons. Sokolov turned and began his long walk back toward the Yemeni border. The secret war was no longer a secret. The world would soon hear of Mirbat, and the thinking soldier was no longer a myth. It was a nightmare that would haunt Viktor Sokolov for the rest of his life. Major Viktor Sokolov did not run from the ridge of the Jebel. He walked.
He moved with the slow, heavy gait of a man who had seen a fundamental law of physics, the law of mass, violated before his eyes. As he retreated toward the Yemeni border, the air was still filled with the rhythmic thump, thump of the Sultan's Bell 205 helicopters arriving to secure the town of Mirbat. But for Sokolov, the most striking thing wasn't the sound of reinforcements. It was the sudden, oppressive silence of the SAS. In the Soviet army, a victory of this magnitude would be followed by a parade. Sokolov noted in the notes he later smuggled out of the GRU archives. There would be speeches, medals, and the roaring of anthems. But as I looked back through my telescope one last time at the Bat House, I saw no celebration. I saw 5 men sitting on the stone steps, their weapons across their knees, staring at the ground. They weren't heroes. They were mechanics who had just finished a particularly grueling shift in a slaughterhouse. They didn't wave at the helicopters. They didn't cheer. They just sat in the heat, absorbing the silence.
This was the most terrifying thing about the different species, their indifference to their own greatness. The 20-minute miracle had lasted nearly 6 hours. The arithmetic of the desert had been brutal. Of the 250 Aloo guerrillas Sokolov had helped train, nearly half were now dead or wounded, scattered across the elephant grass like discarded rags. The irresistible tide of the revolution had been broken against the white walls of a single stone house. I reached my final observation post at 10 o'clock, Sokolov recalled. The Sultan's gendarmerie, the reinforcement unit, had begun the sweep. They were moving through the town, clearing the remaining pockets of resistance. But the SAS troopers, they were already moving to the next task. I saw Captain Mike Keeley, a man who had just survived a 3-hour firefight in a hole in the ground, directing the recovery of the bodies. He wasn't talking to the press. He wasn't talking to his commanders. He was focused on the geometry of the loss. The loss was concentrated in 2 names, Talaiasi Labalaba and Tommy Tobin. For Sokolov, these 2 men represented the anomaly of the standard. I tried to explain it in my debrief to the GRU leadership in Aden, Sokolov said. I told them, we lost because we were fighting men who have had the concept of normal deleted from their DNA. I described how Labalaba fired a 25-pounder gun with a shattered jaw. I described how Tobin, the medic, was shot while treating a comrade and kept trying to reach his bandages. My superiors looked at me as if I had gone mad. They said, Comrade Sokolov, these are just stories of individual bravery. Bravery is not a strategic factor. I realized then that Moscow would never understand. They saw the standard as an accident. I saw it as a design. The design was rooted in the institutional silence of Hereford. As the battle ended, the British government immediately moved to classify the entire event. The Dhofar rebellion was a secret war, and the 9 men at Mirbat were officially not there. The geometry of the secret was perfect, Sokolov noted. The British Prime Minister didn't want the public to know that SAS troops were killing hundreds of Soviet-backed rebels in the Middle East. So, the medals were suppressed. The bravery was hidden. Mike Keeley, the man who had performed the most incredible defensive action of the decade, received a Distinguished Service Order, DSO, a high honor, but one that was issued for services in the field, with no mention of the battle. Labalaba, the man who manning the gun alone, received nothing but a mention in dispatches, the lowest form of recognition. To the world, Mirbat didn't happen, but to the GRU, it was a data point that changed everything. Sokolov's debriefing at the Soviet embassy in Aden lasted 3 days. He sat in a windowless room, facing a panel of officers who demanded to know why 250 revolutionary brothers had fled from 9 colonialists. I told them it was the Vickers paradox, Sokolov explained.
I told them that the British use old tools, the Vickers machine gun, the 25-pounder field gun, because they prioritize reliability and individual skill over technological mass. I told them that an SAS trooper with a bolt-action rifle and a map is more dangerous than a Soviet platoon with a T-54 tank, because the tank has a manual, but the trooper has a brain that has been trained to function when the manual burns. I told them that the SAS operate in the acoustic shadows of the war, the spaces where the radar doesn't reach and the mass doesn't matter. The Soviet reaction was to increase the platform approach. They sent more T-54s. They sent more BM-21 Grad launchers. They doubled down on the mathematics of mass. They didn't understand that the standard is not a weapon you can build. It's a culture you have to grow, Sokolov said.
You cannot manufacture the thinking soldier in a 3-month Spetsnaz course. It requires the Brecon filter. It requires a regiment that has been cleaning its own weapons and planning its own missions since 1941. It requires a philosophy where the corporal is as informed as the colonel. As Sokolov prepared for his return to Moscow, he received a final piece of intelligence from an Aloo scout who had survived the battle. The scout told him that the surviving guerrillas were refusing to go back into the Dhofar province. They were calling the SAS the men who don't die. The myth was born, Sokolov whispered. The SAS hadn't just won a tactical victory at Mirbat, they had achieved a psychological decapitation. They had demonstrated that the standard was so high that it rendered the enemy's numbers irrelevant. In the mind of the guerrilla, if 9 men can kill 100, then an army of 900 is invincible. The geometry of fear had shifted. But for the men in Hereford, there was no myth. There was only the after-action maintenance. Sokolov recalled the final image he had of the town through his telescope before the helicopters obscured the view. He saw the SAS team loading their Bergens into the back of a Land Rover. They were leaving. The Sultan's troops were taking over the fort. The secret war was returning to the shadows. I realized then, Sokolov concluded, that the different species doesn't want the glory. They want the symmetry of the job. They want to finish the work, reset the clock, and go back to the beacons to find the next Labalaba. And as long as they are willing to be invisible, they will be unbeatable. The final part of Sokolov's story wasn't about the battle, but about the haunting legacy of the 25-pounder gun pit. He would spend the rest of his life wondering what would have happened if he had been in that pit. He would spend his career trying to warn the Soviet Union that their mass was a lie. And as he stepped onto the plane for Moscow, Viktor Sokolov realized that the 9 men from Mirbat had not just won a battle, they had won the 20th century. And they had done it while the world was looking the other way. Major Viktor Sokolov died in a small apartment in Moscow in 1994, just as the Soviet Union he had served so faithfully was being sold off for parts. He never received the medal for his service in Oman. In the official records of the GRU, his mission to the Dhofar province was listed as a logistical observation. But on the day he died, sitting on his bedside table was a single charred brass shell casing, a 25-pounder shell he had recovered from the dirt of Mirbat 22 years earlier. "My superiors told me to forget," Sokolov wrote in the final pages of his diary. "They told me that the standard I had witnessed was a fluke of history, a statistical anomaly. They believed that the future of warfare belonged to the BM-21 rocket launcher and the T-72 tank. But as I sat in the Kremlin's briefing rooms throughout the 1980s, watching our mass struggle in the valleys of Afghanistan, I knew the truth. We were still looking for the machine. We should have been looking for the man." The institutional silence regarding the Battle of Mirbat lasted for nearly 30 years. Because the Dhofar rebellion was a secret war,
the British government could not admit that 9 men had fought the most significant defensive action of the decade. "I tracked the survivors," Sokolov noted. "I became obsessed with the different species. I wanted to see what happened to men who had reached the absolute limit of the human spirit and survived. What I found was the most disturbing evidence of all. They simply went back to work." Sergeant Talaiasi, the man who had manning the gun pit with a body full of shrapnel, survived his wounds. He didn't ask for a pension. He didn't write a book.
He went back to Hereford, recovered, and eventually went back to the hills to train the next generation. He remained a ghost for the rest of his career. But the fate of Captain Mike Keeley provided Sokolov with the final, brutal proof of the SAS standard. In 1979, 7 years after Mirbat, Mike Keeley died, Sokolov wrote. He didn't die in a firefight. He didn't die at the hands of a superior enemy. He died on the Brecon Beacons. He was participating in a routine exercise, a 40-mile march in a winter storm, and he succumbed to hypothermia. The man who had survived 250 guerrillas in a 110-degree desert was killed by the very mountains that had forged him. To Sokolov, Keeley's death was not a tragedy. It was a technical validation. It proved that the standard of the SAS is not a status you achieve, Sokolov explained. It is a struggle you maintain every single day. The Brecon Beacons don't care if you won a DSO in Oman. They don't care if you are a legend. The mountain only cares if you can finish the march today. Keeley died because he refused to stop walking, even when his biology had failed. He died because the thinking soldier would rather be a corpse on the ridge than a failure at the finish line. It wasn't until 2001 that the British government finally upgraded the awards for the men of Mirbat. Talaiasi Labalaba was posthumously honoured with a statue at Hereford, and his mention in dispatches was recognised for what it truly was, an act of individual courage that had changed the course of the Middle East. The mathematics of the secret finally dissolved, Sokolov noted, but the geometry of the battle remains. Mirbat is now taught in every Special Forces academy in the world, from Fort Bragg to the Sayeret Matkal. They study the gun pit the way a priest studies a scripture. They are looking for the secret source. They are looking for the magic. I could have saved them the time. Sokolov's final words in his diary serve as the ultimate audit of the abyss. "The secret isn't the gun," Sokolov wrote. "It isn't the Vickers. It isn't the Strike Master jets. The secret is the Brecon filter. It is the 18-month pipeline of physical and psychological destruction that leaves only the autonomous engine behind. The SAS win because they are the only unit in the world that has realized that overwhelming mass is a lie. The only thing that is real is the man who has decided that he is going to stay in the hole until the job is done." The Battle of Mirbat remains the most concentrated demonstration of special operations effectiveness in the 20th century. 9 men against an army. 9 men against the mathematics of mass. 9 men against the inevitable tide. And on July 19, 1972, the inevitable stopped. As the sun sets over Hereford today, the different species are still there. They are sitting in the same stone buildings, cleaning the same kind of rifles, and staring at the same topographic maps. They don't have a parade. They don't have an anthem. They just have the standard. Major Viktor Sokolov was right. You can build 1 million tanks. You can build $1 billion satellite. But you cannot manufacture the standard. You can only discover it in the mud of the beacons and the fire of the desert. The 9 men of Mirbat proved that in the abyss, the only thing that matters is the man who dares. And who dares, wins.